Alright folks, we're almost to the end of the class. Woohoo! Only another week to go after this, and then you have your final and you're all done. So this week we're going to talk about Chapter 11, Game Balancing. Now, game balancing is probably the most critical aspect of your game and is the biggest factor whether it's fun or not. If the game is not balanced and I can just crush everything easily, I lose interest in the game. Or if I'm getting crushed and I constantly can't win, then I'm also not having fun, so I leave the game. So the first game that comes to mind for me is Dark Souls, and if you've ever followed that game or that series, it's a very hard game. But that was the way the game was designed to be. And if you just do a Google search, is Dark Souls too hard? You find a bunch of different subjects on how hard it is it too hard, and stuff like that. So, and I guess it all depends. Again, Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2 were designed to be hard, and they actually do have a big following. Obviously, mostly in Eastern markets, Korea and that kind of thing. There's a pretty big difference between game design, in the East and the West. In the East, most of the gaming is done in like internet cafes, where people pay hourly and things like that, and they can game with friends and stuff, and that's really kind of how they socialize. And games are very grindy compared to Western MMO or Western games, period. But I digress. So, moving on. So, objectives, blah, 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 and finally, something that we're talking about. So, a balanced game is fair to the players, it's not too easy and not too hard, and it makes the skill of the player the most important factor in determining his success. But how do you measure the skill of the player? What's the average player skill? And what is the skill? Is it just pressing the buttons fast? Is it being able to move out of the way, to be able to dodge, things like that? So as far as measuring skill, in World of Warcraft, it's tab targeting, so it doesn't matter where you move, the monster is always going to hit you. And the idea of skill is just, are you hitting your buttons in the right combination? So when these guys fight this dragon here, it doesn't matter where they stand. And they're just clicking your buttons. So you tell me, is there any skill involved in that? Is that a measure of skill? Alright, now this is a game called Terra. And when Terra, the monsters will actually kind of give you cues that they're going to do a special attack or something like this. So, here where the monster is, near the end of this fight, when the monster is almost dead, you see his eyes kind of light up, and that's the cue that he's about to hit. And then you'll see like a little thing on the, he'll swing, and then you'll see the player take damage. But the player can actually dodge that or block that. Now, in this case, this guy doesn't do that, but you'll get the idea.
So it's going to be the normal 3-part combo plus the spring attack. I'll show you that now. Okay. Didn't quite.
There, and that's where the player takes the damage. But you saw his eyes kind of light up. But when the eyes light up, that's the tell. So then your player skill can say, hey, okay, I need to jump to the side, or each character has like a key that they can hit where they can jump back and kind of dodge out of the way, or they can actually bring up their weapon and block the attack. Now because he had this guy almost dead, he chose not to.
But you can see there.
So it all comes down to, I guess, what kind of skill you're trying to promote in your game, and what you view as skill. Alright, and then balance obviously differs big time between PvP and PvE games. PvP is player versus player, and PvE is player versus enemy, meaning it's a computer-generated enemy. So like your single-player games or things like that. Alright, and then it says, a well-balanced PvE or PvE game, has the following, it provides meaningful choices, it avoids dominant strategies, each strategy must have a reasonable chance of producing victory, and a player's skill must affect success. Now sometimes their idea of skill is that you understand your abilities and that you use them in the right rotation. Some abilities will trigger an effect like frost, and then other abilities get bonus damage if the victim is frozen. So if you use the frost first and then use the second ability, you obviously do much more damage. So let's focus on this part about, it provides meaningful choices, and each strategy must have a reasonable chance of producing victory. So there's a game called ArcAge, and ArcAge is actually a Korean kind of a PvP focused game that was brought over to the West by a company called Trion, who's producing it or publishing it here. And there's actually 120 possible classes, so you can take your character and you pick 3 different skill sets, and then there are 120 possible combinations. But out of these 120 possible combinations, most of them are relatively weak compared to the few very strong ones. So here's a chart where it's showing the damage. So if I become a Hexblade and I take Battle Rage, Witchcraft, and Defense as my 3 abilities, then I can only do 7 or 5 damage. Where if I just replace Defense with Sorcery, now I can do 9 damage. And then other ones do 10, other ones do 11, and then 12. So obviously a Demonologist is going to dominate because he can produce so much more damage than the other classes. And if you play that game, you'll find there's only like 10 or 11 actual combinations that are effective in PvP. People that are not doing PvP will play some of the other classes because they like it for fun, or it fits their playstyle. But if you're going to be effective in PvP, there's really only about 6 that are effective. So what's the point then of having 120 combinations if there are only 6 or 7 that are actually effective in the game? And that's also a reason why the ArcAge I think is only a little bit over a year old, but in less than a year they announced they had to cut their servers down. So they started with 21 servers in North America and Europe, and then they cut it down to like 15. So they got rid of like 6 servers, and then even the new servers, nowhere near the amount of people that were there like opening day because so many people were excited about the game. So it can have a huge effect on your game. Alright, so then additional balance requirements for PvP. Players need to perceive the game to be fair. They need to feel that they have a chance. Now, if a very low-skilled player comes up against a high-skilled player, they're not going to have a chance. But if a low-skilled player is constantly being dominated, he's going to leave the game. So most games have like battlegrounds or things like that are PvP areas where it'll be like 10 versus 10, and that way if somebody's weak, they can learn new skills while they're playing with 9 others and kind of get back up to where they need to go. So they talk about here, a player who falls behind should have the opportunity to catch up, things like that. And that's another big difference between Western and Eastern MMOs. Over in the East, it's gear progression. You're constantly grinding for new gear, and the new gear is harder to get. But after the game's been out for several years, new players coming in are way behind, and there's no way they want to grind for a year or two just to be competitive, because by that point everybody else is going to be a tier or 2 ahead of them. So then you kind of like shut your game off from new people or new players. Alright, additional balance requirements for PvE. The player needs to perceive the game to be fair. Players like a challenge, but they don't like something that's way too hard or way too easy. So there should never be like a sharp drop. Alright, avoiding dominant strategies. A dominant strategy is when there's only really one way, and this one way works every time, and it's the best. So you don't want something like that. You want to allow the player to think of new creative ways to do things. You want him to have several options to do things. You don't want to lead the player and say, hey, you can only do this. Here's your narrow path, and you have to stay on this path. Alright, then your book talks about transitive relationships. So, if A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, then obviously A is bigger than C. So there's never any reason to choose B or C because A is always going to be the best. So if you have a situation like that, you want to assign costs so that A is really hard to obtain, B is a little bit easier to obtain, and C is easy to obtain. And that way you're kind of balancing things out. All right, and then they also talk about shadow costs. And costs, or shadow costs, are things that are not immediately apparent. And you may have, like, let's say my A category of weapons are very expensive and they deteriorate at a faster rate. So that deterioration, or repairability, whatever, that's how it goes down, would be the shadow cost. So even after I buy this cool weapon, I can only dominate for a little bit because then the weapon kind of like deteriorates and dies, and I got to go buy a new one. In which case I got to go out and grind and make more money in the game, that kind of stuff. Alright, then your book talks about intransitive relationships like rock, paper, scissors. A beats B, B beats C. And this is very apparent in a PvP game like ArcAge, where you have tanks that are melee, the up front in your face kind of guys with a bunch of armor, and then you have mages that sit in the back and kind of like throw spells. And then you have archers that are very mobile, that are firing arrows back and forth. So the melee guy may struggle against an archer, but he's able to get in close to a wizard guy, and just dominate him. So again, you have that rock paper scissors. So it's all about whenever the arena starts, who's your choice, who comes in there with you. And then they talk about, and I'm going to slew this word really bad, but orthogonal unit differential. And each kind of unit should be unlike the others in some way. When you get into games like World of Warcraft and things like that, everybody knows, if you're a mage, because all mages pretty much look alike. Everybody knows if you're a warrior because all warriors kind of look alike. Other than your character being, an orc or a human or an elf, almost all the armors are the same for, the warriors, and almost all the cloaks are the same for the mages. But you want some way to differentiate your character so he can look different. Most games do this with like an outfit designer, where you can wear the armor for your stats, and then you can wear another set of clothes just for your outward appearance. So the other set of clothes, is what you show in, but it has no effect on your character. And then you can put other armor items in, that match everybody else's, for your stats. Alright, then they talk about PvE games and implementing fewer actions in a game risk exploits. Nothing messes up an online game faster than hacks and exploits. Neverwinter was a game released by Cryptic, and 2 or 3 times there have been major exploits where people have found a way to duplicate money, so they call that dupes. So then you've got, half the server, has billions and billions of gold, and so then prices go way up, so that the person that didn't cheat can now no longer afford things in the game, and it drives people away. So that's where it comes down to make sure that your game is being tested thoroughly. Alright, and then a very critical topic, the role of chance. If chance plays a role, how do you ensure that a more skillful player wins? And you should use chance sparingly. And I hate to keep coming back to this, but ArcAge is an example of this. With ArcAge, the crafting system is totally random number generated. So it doesn't matter what your skill is. I can be, let's say a tier 4 bowcrafter, and you could be a tier 9 bowcrafter. And when I try to make this super cool bow, the random number may just roll a 99 for me, and I win, and I get this cool bow. You may try 100 times and never get a 99 on your roll, so that you'll never be able to get it, even though you're way more skilled than I am. So games like that, where they have random number generation, works big over on the eastern side of the world, where they like to grind and that kind of thing, and getting unique items is kind of like a trophy. Where over here in the western side of the world, people like to be able to feel like they're winning. Nobody wants to waste 3 months in the game gathering resources and trying something 100 times when their buddy just does it once and gets it, and you're like, wait, how is that fair? So if you want any more information on this topic, just do some reading about the ArcAge random number generation crafting system. They call it RNG, and you'll hear a lot of people that play that game talk about RNG Jesus and stuff like that, because they're like, I gotta pray to the gods that I get a good roll. Anyway. So you want to allow the player to choose the action. You want to have player skill influencing that. The best example of this I could give you would be, maybe there was a game called Star Wars Galaxies years ago, and it had probably the most unique crafting system. Basically what would happen is, like, every 10 days new resources would spawn in the world, and you would have to go out and find these resources, because they were always underneath the ground. They weren't like today where they're like sparkling everywhere. So you would have to like do surveys and put miners down and try to find all the different resources, and there would be like 4 or 5 minerals that would spawn throughout the galaxy, and 4 or 5 like liquids that would spawn, and they all had like 10 characteristics, and those different characteristics would influence different parts of the crafting. One characteristic may influence the strength of the weapon, where another would influence damage. So somebody who had been playing the game for years and had always been going out and surveying and gathering the best materials, could make a weapon that nobody else could make. So people that devoted time and effort into the game, and used their survey skills and went to these different locations, and some of them were hard to access, or there were big monsters around and you had to fight and stuff. Those people could make the best weapons, and they were sought after. Hey, there's this one guy, and he makes this weapon that does 20 damage more than any other weapon out there. So it was a very unique crafting system that allowed the player to actually influence it, which was nice. All right, but I digress. So making PvP games fair. To balance symmetric games, you have to treat every player the same, so that they need to follow the same rules, have the same resources, the same victory conditions. But it's very hard in PvP games to do something like this. Now, in Call of Duty, it's relatively easy. But in an online game where somebody, there are people that live in their mom's basement, have a crappy job where they only work a couple hours a week, and they game 8 to 12 hours a day. And there's really no way to compete with something like that, especially if you're a normal person that has a life. All right, then they talk about asymmetric games, and then they talk about StarCraft. StarCraft is a unique game. Everybody starts the same, and then it's up to you to gather more resources and to build different units to overpower your enemy. It's a real-time strategy game, and if you watch some of these pros play on YouTube, they're clicking the mouse like 10, 15 times a second. And there's actually mice that were popular for a while, that would actually record your clicks on there per second and kind of show you on the screen and things like that, to kind of help you, condition you to be a better StarCraft player. But I digress. All right, then you have your balancing issues for persistent worlds, and then think about MMOs. So persistent worlds are never symmetric; they're always intrinsically unbalanced. New players need protection when they first come into the game. Different areas of the game are harder than others. Different areas are more richer with resources, so that means that's where all the PvPers are, waiting for the little miner to come in to try to get some resources to kill him, things like that. So some issues can be rebalanced, on the fly by patching. Okay, hey, it turns out, we released this game. The archer guy really sucks, and he's getting dominated by everybody else. So let's add a couple new skills or buff his skills, and do that in a patch. Or let's nerf the other guy's skills, so they're not as tough. And nobody likes the nerf. All right, for PvE games, you need to offer challenges at a consistent level of difficulty, and avoid the learn by dying designs. You don't want the player to keep learning because we just died. We've been going through this raid for over an hour and we just wiped the whole party, so we got to start the whole thing over again. All right, you don't want to have stalemates, where it's kind of equal and it kind of goes on forever, things like that. You want to provide some kind of information when the player needs to make a critical decision. Like in that Terra game, every monster has a tell, whether their eyes light up and gleam for a second, or you see red on the ground where that's where an attack is going to be. You want to give them some kind of information so they know, hey, at this point I either need to move or I'm going to get hit. And they talk about avoiding required extrinsic information. That's information outside of the game. And that's kind of plus and minuses. Some people like researching game information, other people don't. And then include challenges that are appropriate for the genre. Alright, and then managing difficulty. There's always going to be things that are outside the designer's control. You can't control how long a person plays your game. You'll have some people that maybe play a few hours a week, and then you'll have other people that play it like it's a second job. Some players have awesome hand-eye coordination, other players don't. Some players have great reasoning skills, other players don't. So stuff like that is out of the designer's control. But he wants to pick on, a certain individual. Who am I making the game for? So remember when we go back a few chapters when we talked about this, you need to have in your mind the person that's going to play your game. Who is your ideal player? And then build the game around that, and kind of have a medium level, so that people who are above that can exceed in the game, and people below that will have a little bit tougher struggle. Alright, so there's types of difficulty. There's absolute difficulty, and then there's relative difficulty, and then there's perceived difficulty. So absolute difficulty is just the regular difficulty, compared to similar challenges. So no matter how geared you are, it's always going to be this tough. where relative difficulty actually focuses on your power. If you're a level 5 character, you're not going to be able to defeat a level 10 boss. So that would be relative difficulty relative to your power. But absolute difficulty, like in the new Star Wars The Old Republic, whatever planet you go to, your level actually scales, your power scales to that planet's level. So if you're level 65 and you go to a level 30 planet, your level actually gets scaled down to level 30. So you're always going to be at the same level as the monsters. Alright, then perceived difficulty is just absolute difficulty minus the power provided plus in-game experience, blah blah blah. Alright, and then they have a little chart. Hey, look at this. Whoa! Basically, you want the time invested in an action to produce, to be difficult enough to reap the reward that's provided. If I raid for an hour on a very difficult dungeon, and when I get to the end, if the reward's not great, I'm going to be kind of disappointed, and then people are not going, the word's going to get out, and then people are not going to participate in that raid. So all the work that went into designing that will be wasted. And it's always harder to fix something after the players know about it, because on your launch day is your launch week is really the biggest week of your game. That's where you're going to have the most players, depending on how the marketing went. So, like ArcheAge, when it launched, it had, I want to say 18 servers, and all of them had queues of people trying to get in, so they had to add 3 more servers, so then they went to 21, and there were still queues where people were waiting an hour to get into the game. And now, a year later, because of all the mistakes they've had, they've shut down 5 or 6 servers, and there's no longer any queues, and most of the servers don't even hit high population anymore. So it's harder to fix things than it is to release with things. So that's why testing and beta testing is so important. Alright, then you want to have some kind of difficulty progression. You don't want everything to be the same throughout the game. You want the player to gain power but then face new and tougher challenges. So the relative difficulty must increase over time to counteract the player's growing in-game experience. Alright, and then in single-player games, it's a lot easier to manage balance because the player can pick the difficulty that they want. Do they want easy, normal, hard, nightmare, things like that? And then, they can make the game harder themselves when they want to, or make the game easier when they want to. And that's typically why single-player games tend to outsell online games in the majority of cases. Now, there are obviously outliers for that. All right, understanding positive feedback. Positive feedback occurs when a player's achievement changes the game state, making future achievements easier. So, what example of that? Well, what if there's a boss in a dungeon and some player finds that there's some weird shelf that he can kind of jump into, and from there then the monster can't attack him. And then he can just sit there and kill him. And then he posts that online, and now everybody can do it. So now we've made that achievement easier to get. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be an exploit, but when somebody figures out how to do something, they're obviously going to post it online, and then people are going to discover it, then they're going to spread it by word of mouth, and then whatever it was that fixed, it's going to be easier for everybody to do. And you want some of that in the game, obviously. You want players to be rewarded. Hey, I was the first one to do this, and here's how I did it. And then they have that status. And obviously it discourages things that are too tough. It rewards success. All right, controlling positive feedback. You don't want to give them too much power as a reward. So, hey, you guys defeated this raid. Here's your cool reward. But we don't want to make it too high. You might also want to introduce some negative feedback. Achievements have a cost as well as a benefit. So another way, and I think that this is the way that your book focuses on feedback, this is feedback to the individual player. When I do something right, I get positive feedback, and when I do something wrong, I get negative feedback. My player might die. Where if I kill a boss, I'll get some cool, the Sword of Truth. And that positive feedback can come in lots of different forms. In a PvP game like ArcheAge, there's actually 4 castles that you can control. So if you can get a group of guys and be very effective in PvP, you can actually take one of these castles, and then you control a big patch of land, and people can put houses there, and you can set what the tax rate is. So that then your guild or your group is constantly receiving money each week from these taxes. All right, so other balance considerations, avoid stagnation, and that occurs, when the player just doesn't know what to do next. Some games do this well, other games not so much. In World of Warcraft, basically, or any other theme park game, you go to like a quest hub, a place where there's people to receive, and you get your quests, and then you go out and you kill the 10 boars, and you can do all the other stuff, and you go back to the quest hub. And then finally, at the end of that, you get a quest that says go to this next quest hub, and it's marked on your map. So you always know what you're doing next. Where other games like The Secret World give you clues, but really it's up to you to put it all together and decide how to proceed. Or a sandbox game like EVE Online, when you jump in there, you're not told what to do. You can go do whatever you want. You can go mine asteroids, you can go and discover wormholes, you can go scan for anomalies, you can go do PvP, but nobody tells you what to do. You're like, okay, now what do I do? Well, you can do whatever you want. It's a sandbox. Alright, so designed to make tuning easy. Generalize mechanics when possible, to avoid creating special cases. Basically, you only want to make one change at a time, and it's like this for everything. When you're working on a network, or you're working on a computer game, or you're working on a car, you only want to change one thing at a time, and then see what effect that has. Because if I change 4 things and then release it in the game, and then it has a negative consequence, do I really know which of the 4 things generated that? Alright, and then the big one, obviously, keep records of everything that you do. And that way you can go back and see, oh, here's what I was thinking when I did this. Because, most of the time, especially if you work for a bigger company, these games take years to create, and you may be thinking of something in the first year when the game is made, and then totally forget about that in year 3, and then be coming back and like, why did I make this decision? What was I thinking here? So it's nice to keep records. Alright, so summary, blah blah blah. You should design a fair game, avoid dominant strategies, use chance sparingly, manage the difficulty, and control positive feedback. Hooray! Alright, this week in Angel, you've got 3 assignments. You got a quiz. You have an assignment on game balance. So you're going to play a single player game at this website, and then you're going to discuss, was the opposition balanced, and were the decisions balanced against each other. And then you're going to write something up, and you're going to deposit it there. And then you're going to go to the design review, and you're going to watch this video. And this video is only like 2 or 3 years old. Well, actually, it was loaded 2 or 3 years ago, but so it's a little bit older than that. And then you're going to write a review, or not a review, but your view on this video. At least 200 word minimum. Just, what did you learn from the video? What did you take away? What did you not like about the video? What did you learn about the game design field? Just things like that. And if you like this video, and I got to warn you, this video is like 52 minutes long. There's a movie that's on Netflix currently. It's called Indie Game the Movie, that follows 2 groups. Well, one's a 2-man design team, and then one's a kind of a guy by himself, as they're working on their indie games and kind of following their progress, from start to finish, and then kind of like tells how much money they made at the end. But it's really kind of interesting to see just how long these things made. There's a game called Super Meat Boy, and then there's another game called Fez, and those are the 2 games that they follow. And you look at Super Meat Boy, and you think, well, how long would that actually take to make? And then you find out how long it took to make, and 2 people and all these hours, and you're like, what the? And so it's very interesting, especially if you're really thinking about game design as a career. Those are some interesting videos to watch. So that's about it. If you have any questions, make sure you email me. Other than that, have a great week, folks.